Hi, Narrate. Hannah here. We are scattering on the morning of Saturday, November 9th. We have 3 projects lined out and ready to go. The first is tag pulling on Mount Helena. We'll go for a hike and pull the tags off trees that did not get thinned out or cut down due to beetle kill. This one is super family friendly and a great way to meet new people and have some conversation. Second, we are headed to Habitat for Humanity to help with the home builds going on in East Helena. You must be 18 years or older for that one. That's going to be an awesome morning. And third, we are headed out to the Scratch Gravels for some trail construction. A new trail has recently been approved and is funded by Ales for Trails money, and we'll get to do some handwork on the new trail. So super exciting stuff. Email me at hannah@narratechurch.org for more information or to sign up.
Daniel 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, stationed throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 administrators, one of whom was Daniel. To these the satraps gave account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Soon Daniel distinguished himself above the other administrators and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to appoint him over the whole kingdom. So the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for complaint against Daniel in connection with the kingdom. But they could find no grounds for complaint or any corruption because he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption could be found in him. The men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." So the administrators and satraps conspired and came to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an interdict, that whoever prays to any god or human for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the interdict and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and interdict. Although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room open toward Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him, just as he had done previously. Then those men watched and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, "O king, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to any god or human within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the den of lions?" The king answered, "The thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they responded to the king, "Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the interdict you have signed, but he is saying his prayers 3 times a day." When the king heard the charge, he was very much distressed. He was determined to save Daniel, and until the sun went down, he made every effort to rescue him. Then the conspirators came to that king and said to him, "Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no interdict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." Then the king gave the command, and Daniel was brought and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you." A stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of his lords, so that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No entertainment was brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at dawn the king got up, and at first light hurried to the den of lions. When he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out anxiously to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you faithfully serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel then said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him. Also before you, O king, I have done no wrong." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had been trusted in his God. The king gave a command, and those who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. Before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language throughout the whole world, May you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people shall tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
Nice work. Thanks. So if you're brand new with us, maybe it's been a while or never before, part of what I think is helpful to name is you're kind of catching us at the end of the movie, which doesn't mean I think this morning is self-contained enough to give it meaning, but just to say we started this series back in September from Daniel, and our motivation for doing so was we recognized that we were moving into this election season. And part of what I love about that story is I just feel like it just captures everything that we're trying to be, like these people who are faithful to God and yet thrive in their everyday culture and marketplace and work. And Daniel kind of embodies that. So we thought that he might provide a narrative that we could kind of attach ourselves to as we do the hard work of like caring deeply about the election and our convictions and how that therefore leads us to vote, but at the same time recognizing that there's a way to go about that honors God, and there's a way that goes about that's frankly not very honoring at all. And so we started this series way back in September in order to just kind of celebrate Daniel as this exemplar of somebody who did have deep conviction. And at times his conviction cost him something, even relationships at times. And yet, hopefully by now, and if you're new to this, you wouldn't have seen this, but what we've seen over and over and over again was that his default way of showing up, his default posture, was one of kindness. And he was conciliatory, which means he wasn't looking for an argument. He was doing everything he could to kind of end arguments. So next week, we're technically still in Daniel. Next week, if you don't know, I'm really, really excited for next week that Leslie and the team has been working on this. We've been working on this since Easter, actually, where next week we're doing the entire musical order, liturgy, order of service, whatever you want to call it, that we did on Easter. And we chose that, it just struck us on Easter of like, wait a minute, what if the Sunday after the election, no matter who wins, because we don't know who's going to win. We didn't know then either. We might not even know next Sunday who won. But what if we just kind of reinforce to ourselves like God is king? And that'll coincide with Daniel 7, which is awesome, and it gets into why I think Daniel was one of Jesus' favorite characters. But really the narrative portion of this kind of ends this week, because if you know Daniel, after this it gets a little weird, which is why we're going to do other things after next week. But here's the question that I want to ask this morning, and it's a hard question, I think. Like, how do you get good people? Actually, I heard Dallas Willard ask this recently in a podcast. I put that podcast on the mind map. And to be sure that when we ask this question, for me, it's like, it starts with the person in the mirror. Like, how do you become a good person? And maybe you're in the season of your own life where you're just like, I am such a pathetic person, and hence the question. Maybe you're in this season where you have the luxury of feeling decent about yourself, and yet you're aware of the brokenness. Maybe you're thinking about parenting or culture or work or hiring good people. Like Dallas Willard points out, like this is, first of all, it's the question. It's the human question. But also, it's not a uniquely Christian question. Like Christian or otherwise, we all have to deal with this question, but Christianity shows up and claims to have answers to the question. How do you get good people? And this, for me, it brings to mind several things. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, where he says something like, in order to have good government, you've got to have good people, but in order to have good people, you've got to have good religion, in order to have, and there's this like cycle. Like, how do we do this? How do we ensure that our kids become good, that we become good, that together we become good, that we show up in good ways? And this brings to mind something Jesus said in the end of his Sermon on the Mount, which many would call his most important sermon. I think it's worth looking at over and over and over again, which in a way we do. Jesus says this, everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who's built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. I've been to Israel a couple times. No plans of going soon. But what we're talking about here is what they call wadi washouts. The topography, the geography is such that it can rain up to 20 miles away in the mountains. You can be down near the Dead Sea and not know that it had rained, but the construction of the soils and such is you end up with this flash flood that comes crashing down the ravine, or what they call wadis, and in the end you can get killed. That happens every summer. People get killed by these. So Jesus, what he's doing is he's grabbing this image of, if you build your house in the wadi on the sand, it's toast, and if you build it on the rock, it'll stand. Dallas Willard's summary of this text, which is one of my favorite Dallas Willardisms, is, what if Jesus can give us the kind of life that can withstand all of life's storms? And in a sense, that's the quest, isn't it? Like when we ask this question, like, how do we get good people? We're probably all self-aware enough to know that when the wind is at your back, when things are going your way, when business is successful and there is no financial stress, and relationships are well, and your kids are doing well, and all the things are lining up, it's kind of easy. It's not really the question we're asking. In fact, Christianity at its best, what it answers is this question of, like, how do we thrive in the midst of suffering? When things aren't going our way, when people aren't well, when people aren't doing well. How do we get good people? And I say all that to say, I think part of what makes Daniel so stinking awesome is if you just stop and look at his suffering. Like if you just stop and go, like, he's an exemplar of thriving in the midst of storms. In fact, I was on a ride last Monday, and I found myself thinking about this, started this list in my head of all the things that we've watched Daniel lose. And it's a remarkable list. I mean, here's just my own attempt at an inventory of Daniel's loss. If we go back to Jerusalem, before his country was destroyed, or as it was destroyed, he obviously lost his family. He lost his form of government. He lost his native country. He lost his personal residence. He lost his home city, his friend group, like everyone that he socialized with. He lost his place of worship and his occupation and his every personal possession. He lost his personal freedom. He lost his daily schedule, which is more important to some of us than others. He lost his language, even his ability to speak. He lost his name. We've seen that battle. He lost his ethnic food, or his comfort food, whatever you want to call that. He lost his holidays and his celebrations. And I think he probably lost his bike and his bonsais too. Like, in our own cultural moment, like, we would understand grief and suffering to such an extent that nobody would have blamed Daniel if he'd have become just completely done, if he'd have just kind of went off into a corner and hid somewhere. Nobody would blame him if he'd become the most angry, aggressive person ever. No one would have blamed him if he became the most spiritually cynical person anywhere. He could have become an alcoholic. He could have become any number of things, and we would look at his list and go, yeah, that seems fair. And yet part of what we're confronted with is this man who thrived in the midst of all of the chaos. And the question then becomes, what was Daniel's secret sauce? Now, I can't prove this, I don't have enough initials behind my name to prove it, but I think part of the construction of Daniel is that what the book does is it gives us the what, or the who, and then it sneaks in the how. So far, what we've got is these heavy doses of just, this guy's amazing. In fact, he's unique. If you know the Bible, he's a very unique hero because he's one of the only heroes I can think of who we never get his follies. We don't get his faults. Daniel's, he's bordered on perfect. In fact, I can't think of a time in this book where you'd go well, there's a character, Mar. So we've just got this big dose of Daniel and his exemplary character. And then I think the book starts to ask, so how? What made him him? It reminds me a little of, remember a few years ago, there was so much a conversation around Tom Brady's nutritional regimen. You remember this? And the only reason we cared was because he was 40-something beating out 20-somethings at a young man's sport. And it was that led to us going man, how does that guy eat? How does he drink? What does he do? What does he not do? I think Daniel's a little bit like that. The book is constructed for you to fall in love with the character and then start to go, how? Because it wasn't ideal circumstances. It wasn't a lack of suffering. He got both barrels more than most of us. He got Jobbed in the truest sense of the word. And there's just a few verses in chapter 6 that for me have stood out for months now. Verse 10, although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued, and I want to come back to that word. He continued to go to his house, which had windows in his upper room open toward Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him just as he had done previously. I have questions probably like you do of like, what about why does it have to be so public? Like, why can't you just do this privately? And I never found really good answers to that other than it's a cultural thing. But there's 2 things that really stood out to me that I think are worth looking at. First is that word continued, and then that idea of just as he had done previously. Like, I know some of us claim that we're not habit people and others are, and some say they're routine people and others say they are or aren't, and I call BS on all that. We're all routine people, even if your routine is supposed lack of routine. But what is the story telling us here? Like, what do we know about, what did the text just tell us potentially about Daniel's secret sauce? Did he start praying? And I actually don't think we're talking about one thing here. I think we're talking about 3. We're talking about prayer, but then we could nuance that and talk about silence and solitude, which some would say are separate things and others would say they're the same thing. But what is it telling us about his habit? Did he start praying when things got hard? Or was this a part of his routine? We could ask this question: what if Daniel was a man who took spiritual practices and thus spiritual formation seriously? Like, what if he was like, see, here's what stands out to me. He's lost everything. He's had to reinvent himself entirely. And yet, apparently, one of the things he refused to lose was some habit of spiritual practice, some routine. I mean, frankly, I don't like this, but if you wanted to use Daniel to say, like, Sunday's not important, just go live the, like, individual spiritual life, he would be your guy. But even then, I think it would start with, like, so what do the 7-day routines look like? Like, he lost his temple. He lost his community. He lost his clergy. He lost all of that, and yet there's things he wouldn't lose. Look at the next verse. Then those men watched and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Here's just a kind of cultural context things. Apparently, Persia, more than Israel even at this time, had this regimen of praying 3 times a day. But one of the interesting things was they were commanded not to ask for anything personal, but only for blessings on behalf of the king and the community. So we started in chapter 1 with this Daniel who sees God as personal. He's seeking God for his mercy. The last verse talked about how he worships and prayed. And so here's the question. What if Daniel just revealed the secret to his kind, conciliatory, convicted life? What if he took seriously there's different words in different eras, but it's this idea of spiritual practices. And I think maybe the best way to think about spiritual practices is to use some non-religious kind of metaphors. I mean, think about the 18-year-old who shows up, say, at Carroll College on a football scholarship. Now, does that kid, does him showing up in the weight room consistently, does that get him points on the football field? No, it doesn't. But does it theoretically lead to wins when the game of football is being played? Yeah, I mean, so I think where people like me, and this could be where some of you have resistance to spiritual practices, where we get off on them is we start thinking, and this is probably where your bad religious experience comes in, we start thinking going to church is the goal. We start thinking reading or praying our Bible is the goal. It's not. It's like going to the weight room. Like if you're going to the weight room for the sake of winning football games, it's a means to an end, but it's not the end. In fact, when they get to their first game of the season, do the referees go like, okay, so we've done the math and we've determined that Carroll College has accumulated X number more hours of time in the weight room than this other team, and so they're going to start with a 10-point lead. No, that's actually not the assumption of the weight room. But the assumption of the weight room is the fruit of doing so will bear itself out as the game is played. Similar to something like playing guitar. Like, does practicing your guitar, does that gain you points for Sunday morning or whatever your performance venue is? I'm not suggesting they perform, but hopefully we all know what we mean here. No. That's actually not the point. The point is that the skill itself that you're working on translates to the game that really matters. In fact, some of you may remember several years ago, there was this psychologist who developed this theory called flow thinking, and it was a really big deal, and it was really popular because what flow thinking talked about is that the goal of life really is to get to that place and find those things where you just lose track of time and you do it like forever without thinking about it. Well, right before he died, he actually issued one last final study, so to speak, where he said, actually, I think flow theory has been greatly abused in our culture. Because he said, we think that like the person who gets on the stage during the concert and plays the guitar, that they're in flow theory whenever they're playing the guitar. And he said, that's not actually what the research says. That actually, when that person is practicing the guitar, whether they practice for 10 minutes or 10 hours, about every 10 or 15 minutes, what the research says is they're re-choosing to do the practice. In other words, that guitarist, when they're in their room by themselves doing the work, they're not in flow. They're in like full grunt work mode. And the grunt work mode leads to the flow. And what I want to suggest to you is, what if that's how the scriptures would have us understand something like Daniel and his habits, his practices? Does getting alone with God and praying, are there times where you do that in flow? I would hope so. And are the majority of the times where you're just like grinding it out and every 5 minutes you're choosing to stay engaged, to stay in silence, to stay in solitude? That would seem to be what those who actually do this say. And then look at verse 23. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Is the goal of Daniel's spiritual life that he prays every day? I would argue no way, not even close. There it is, isn't it? Like there's the win. Like that's the Super Bowl. That's the end zone. What did it help him do? He trusted in his God, and those around him understood him to be a person who is trusting in God. So here's my question. Can we become Daniel kinds of people without Daniel-like commitments to spiritual practices? It seems to me, and I could climb onto a soapbox here and I'm going to be very careful, but it does seem to me, and I think part of what's fallen apart for me since 2020 and the way my leadership has changed, is it does seem to me that much of Western Christian thought is predicated upon the idea that the spiritual practices are negotiable and you don't need them. And I can't point to a person that I go like, man, that person is connected and trusting who doesn't take them seriously. It seems like a fictitious narrative. That somehow in our desires to become the kinds of people who thrive publicly, who make Jesus attractive, just like Daniel did, the assumption in the background is we're people who take our spiritual formation exponentially more seriously than anybody else does. And to do that without becoming a Pharisee along the way. Like who is it that said is the hardest thing in the world is to cease to be the prodigal son and not become the older brother? It's really, really hard to do. So what are we talking about spiritual practices if this is brand new to you? We're talking about any assortment of things like prayer, like solitude, like silence, like worship, like giving, like service, like community, all of these things. I remember hearing John Mark Comer say way back in 2020, like everybody wants community, which I would call as a spiritual practice, until it costs them something, until it's inconvenient because something else is going on that night, or whatever. Can we become Daniel kinds of people without Daniel-like commitment to spiritual practices? What if we do him a grave injustice if we walk away from him and go like, what an amazing person, and we miss, the habit, the discipline, the grinding it out. In fact, this stands out to me. Here's a statement about Jesus. In the morning while it was still very dark, he got up, this is talking about Jesus, went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And I, like sarcastically, or maybe it's cynically, or maybe it's overly aggressively, there's part of me that goes like, why do I think that I can like thrive spiritually in ways that Jesus himself couldn't? Because he was Son of God, human, divine, in ways that I'll never fully understand, and yet I still get that like he could have sinned, and he could have strayed, and he could have done all these things, and yet he was God too, and he needed this. What if part of the invitation of Daniel is to become a person who spends a lot of energy understanding, like, what are the spiritual practices that God is calling me to, and how do I get to experiment with this? And also understanding, like, they're going to change. Like, this is some training that I get to do this next year, but it's around this idea of, like, as life change, so are your spiritual practices going to have to be adaptable. They're going to have to move and flow and change in different ways. It's going to look different for somebody with toddlers in the house than it is for someone who's an empty nester. It's going to look different for a single person than it is for a married, or someone who doesn't have roommates for someone who does. It's going to look different if you're in a season where you're taking chemotherapy than it does in a season where you're healthy and thriving. Like, of course. And yet there's so many things in our lives that as soon as our patterns get threatened, we figure out how to reinvent ourselves. And it would seem like the way of Jesus is to invite us back into that as it relates to practices. So I was talking to the spiritual director that I talked to, who I love. His name is Bob. He lives in Gig Harbor, Washington, back by you guys, where you guys used to live, Dave and Connie. And he was a pastor who then became a Navy chaplain. So he and I just really like this guy. I've never even seen him face to face, but he strikes me as pretty old and very wise and super awesome. And I was talking to him this week, and we were talking about this because I was telling him, like, Bob, part of what I'm trying to steward right now is I no longer believe that following Jesus is easy. Like, I think it's going to take a high priority or else it's not going to happen. And I think that's becoming more and more true with every passing year. And so I said to him, so did you find that people in the military naturally lent themselves to spiritual practices more than just us civilian folk, because those types of people are actually already gravitate to practices and just discipline? And he actually never answered my question. But he said, let me tell you a story, Adam. He said, one time I was stationed on a carrier, and as the chaplain, it was his job to provide Sunday worship services. And he said, there was this guy, and he kept saying, like, he was just this little guy. And he said, this guy, he showed up for church every time. He said, unless, obviously, he was, like, out doing something, I never knew what he did, but he was always there every Sunday. It was a practice of his. And then he said, and then we got, however military life goes, the boat comes back to San Diego, whatever, and one day he was walking on the beach, and he said, I looked up, I'm walking on the beach, and I look up, and there's that guy, he said, and he's got an outbound motor on his back, like a boat motor. He's like, he came walking up out of the water like some kind of X-Men character. He said, and he was just little, and he said, like, there's sand, like, dripping off of him. We all know how uncomfortable that was, and he's like, literally, he had an outbound boat motor on his back. He said, so I approached him, and I said, you're a SEAL. And he goes, yeah, I'm a SEAL. You caught me. And he said, how did you become a SEAL? And he said, the only way to become a SEAL is to want to be a SEAL more than you want to be alive. And I just wonder, in a culture that's less conducive to our faith, and one where we still have the same commission to go out into culture and be kind and conciliatory and make Jesus attractive, if that might awaken us. Jesus said something really similar. Like, if whoever finds his life loses it, whoever loses it finds it. If anybody wants to come after me, take up your cross and follow me. Now listen, I think we all are in agreement. None of us wants to create a community of Pharisees, and this could get really gross really fast. But as we walk away from Daniel and walk into an undetermined amount of chaos, it seems inevitable one way or the other. If part of the call of Jesus on people like us and places like this is to recognize that the anchor points are people like Daniel, who had these regimens who didn't make him better, but they helped him trust God in any and all circumstances. I celebrate that you're here because I think that's part of what's changing for me. Is I think Sunday as a spiritual practice is way more important than it was 15 years ago. And maybe that's because I'm 15 years older, but we're just so glad to worship with you. And there's just so many of you that we're just seeing, like, there's this practice forming, and way to go. And frankly, that's why we take communion every week. There's so many built-in confessions. First of all, it brings you back to that first question of, like, how do we become good people? And part of the design of taking communion together is to confess, like, God, here I am. Here's my stuff, but for your grace, I'd be toast. And the tangibility of the bread and the wine is also designed to hear you saying in the name of Christ and who shed his blood on the cross, you're forgiven. And it's this encouragement that ours is not just a psychological faith, but the claim of Christianity, you saw it in the early part of Daniel, he had this powerful Spirit on him. That's the claim of communion, is like the Holy Spirit in us. Not God intellectually moving in us, but God physically moving through us. And that's historically been called a mystery. So if you want to take communion with us, there'll be bread over here, and there's a gluten-free option, and wine over there, and there's a juice option. You just have to prompt those. And the answer to the question, am I invited, is yeah, to the extent that you're a follower of Jesus, please come participate with us and use this space in whatever way you want. And if you don't want to participate or you're not a follower of Jesus, it's one of those, like, what's awkward for you isn't awkward for the rest of us. Like, as you take a pass or slip off to the bathroom or something, like, we're all too busy thinking about ourselves to really notice anyway. So please don't get too caught up in your head there, though we get and kind of grieve that can be weird for you, especially if you're a guest. So let me pray. Jesus, thanks for the invitation that you have for us to follow you. And yet, God, we're so grateful for your grace. And yet we're also grateful for examples of people like Daniel that grace, it's opposed to earning, it's not opposed to effort. And again, Jesus, we just confess that some of us are more prone to being a Pharisee than others, and yet, Jesus, I just pray that like the opposite of the wrong thing is not no thing, it's the right thing. And so would you help us jump into the practices in ways that honor you and those who've practiced them before us. And then, Jesus, we say thank you for this time to take communion, and thanks for the bread and the wine and all that it allows us to confess. And we just acknowledge the mystery of that and say, come, Holy Spirit, would you send yourself into us and us into the world, just like Daniel? And in the same way, would you send yourself into this bread and wine, and in so doing into us in ways that we mysteriously just confess we don't get, and we celebrate. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org.
You can also look us up on Facebook or Instagram. Thanks for listening.